Thank you for attending our Planet Tracker virtual conference, ESG in the Global Plastic Supply Chain, and covering material risks and opportunities in a changing world. Our keynote today is by Gregory J. Fleming, President and Chief Executive Officer, Rockefeller Capital Management, a global capital markets leader and innovator. Our closing remarks are by Chairman Raul Grijalva, ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, U.S. House of Representatives, and a leading lawmaker addressing the plastics crisis. Alongside capital markets and legislative leaders, we have over 700 registered individuals today, representing more than 500 institutions, and 17 other industry leaders and trailblazers speaking today. Recordings of the conference will be available afterwards. Because each of us are here today to solve the plastics crisis, I have one favor to ask of you. Please use the chat function to connect with each other and with us and share ideas. My role will be to follow up afterwards with everyone who comments in the chat box. So if you comment in the chat box, you'll hear from me and all of us collectively. Plastic is challenging. Beyond the toxic chemical releases and greenhouse gases emitted during production, each year millions of tons of plastic flow into our oceans. While plastics harms animals and fish around the world, and many times plastics is even found in the food we eat. Yet, plastic is a product we use each day through all sectors of the economy. So today we are going to discuss what actions we can take today to solve this crisis. There are many options. Here are some examples. Can companies produce less single-use plastic and mainstream refill and reuse models while simplifying packaging to use less toxic chemicals? Can companies decrease greenhouse gas emissions from plastic production in line with the Paris Agreement criteria? Because we cannot solve climate change without solving the plastics crisis, and we cannot solve the plastics crisis without solving climate change. Can companies work alongside environmental justice leaders and communities to address issues while co-creating beneficial solutions? Can we improve recycling systems and make deposit return schemes and extended producer responsibility normal and easy across industry? Can companies disclose both how much virgin and recycled plastic they use and their time-bound strategies to reduce plastic pollution? Finally, can investors and bankers support industry transition via portfolio management and issuing green bonds and loans to retail industry? These are the issues we are going to discuss today. Finally, Planet Tracker wants to thank Minderoo Foundation, Flotilla Foundation, and Plastic Solutions Fund. Our co-sponsors, the CFA Society of Boston and CFA Montreal, are very proud to have your support. And many of our colleagues, including Chris Therio, Andrew Wetzel, Patricia Schneider, Dominic Lyle, Michael Grease, and many, many others. Thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Brock, Special Correspondent Reuters, who will moderate our first session. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Gabriel. Gabriel said, I'm Joe Brock, and my job today is to lead this panel to give some global context to this huge problem. Joining me is Dr. Carl Lavender-Law, is a research professor of oceanography at Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Carl studies the sources, distribution, transformation, and fate of plastic debris in the ocean. I'm also joined by Dr. Ramesh Ramachandran, who is the CEO of Minderoo's No Plastics Waste Initiative. Before joining Minderoo, Dr. Ramesh was CEO and senior executive at several chemicals firms in a career in the industry spanning 30 years. Ramesh is currently based in Princeton. Hello, hi Kara, hi Ramesh, thanks for joining this panel.
Good to be here.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Kara, can I start off with you? Gabriel gave us a lot of very important questions to think on, and I think everyone who's on this event will be aware of just what an enormous problem we have with plastic pollution. Could you give us a sense of the scale? What is the extent of the environmental damage caused by plastic waste in the land, sea, and air?
Absolutely. Yes. Thanks, Joe. I think I'll start from the ocean because as an oceanographer trained in ocean physics, naturally, that's where my focus on the plastics problem began. That was about 15 years ago when I started thinking carefully about this. And the ocean really is the end of the pipe. Despite being the end of the pipe, the public attention to plastics in the environment really largely began in the ocean. We heard things like talk about garbage patches where bits of broken down floating plastics accumulate far offshore, carried there by ocean currents. We've seen images of seabird bellies filled with recognizable plastic trash, bottle caps, and cigarette lighters. And we've seen images decades old and also very recent of marine mammals entangled in lost or discarded fishing gear that have continued ghost fishing. From our perspective at Sea Education Association, we've had actually thousands of undergraduate students and scientists for decades studying ocean plastics. Our students sail on tall sailing ships in the open ocean. And twice a day, every day, they tow nets at the sea surface to collect plankton and other marine life in support of their student sea semester research projects. And what we have found since the 1970s and the 1980s are bits of plastic smaller than your pinky fingernail, mixed in with animals that form the base of the food web. So naturally, these kinds of images are very disturbing to the public and to all of us as citizens of the earth. And these images of plastics far, far from shore, far from the people that likely generated and used the plastics. These plastics interacting with wildlife have generated concern rapidly about the impacts that you mentioned about plastic waste on marine animals. And this is everything from fishing gear to items that all of us use every day, things like plastic bags and straws and food packaging, to those small bits I described a second ago, which are typically called microplastics. When we think about the impacts of plastics in the ocean specifically, there is very clear evidence of harm due to entanglement. We've all seen seals with nets around their necks, clearly injured, often fatally. And there's also serious concern right now about the effects of animals ingesting those microplastics together with the chemical additives or the contaminants that are associated with those. But the first step is understanding where in the ocean or where in the environment the plastic is accumulating, where it is contaminating ecosystems. So from the ocean perspective, we know that plastic debris is floating at the sea surface. It's suspended deep in the water column. It's buried in seafloor sediments. We know that plastic trash contaminates beaches around the world, and it's floating in the middle of the oceans. And the smallest particles have been documented not only in the heavily populated tropics and subtropics, but also in the really sparsely populated regions of the Arctic and Antarctic. And microplastics have even been found frozen into sea ice. But this is obviously not just an ocean problem. Although oceans really raise the issue, we've now, as a scientific community, been looking throughout all of Earth's ecosystems, and we have found plastics in freshwater environments, including lakes, rivers, and streams, the terrestrial environment, including agricultural and other soils. And microplastics have been found in the air, in snow, in rain falling on US national parks, in drinking water, bottled water, wastewater, storm water, and in our food and drink. It seems from the scientific evidence that the smaller the plastic particle, the more abundant and widespread they are, especially microfibers. And that's because they can be readily transported not only in the water, but also in the air. So this then raises concerns about human health exposure, not only through eating and drinking, but also through inhalation. One important thing to remember is that microplastics, even though they are the most abundant and wide form of plastic debris in the environment, they are not uniformly distributed. They are in different concentrations in different places. They are not uniform in their composition. They're made of innumerable different types of plastics. They're in different sizes, different shapes. They have different chemical additives. And for this reason, much work remains to really fully understand both the distribution of these plastics in our environment, as well as the full suite of their impacts, especially of microplastics on wildlife and on humans. What we do know is that since 1950, more than 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics have been produced globally, and the majority of those have chemical structures that are highly resistant to biodegradation. Of those plastics, only 9% have ever been recycled, with the vast majority having ended up in landfills or the environment once they become waste, and that's where they will persist for decades or longer. Finally, if historical trends in plastic production, use, waste generation and waste management continue, we estimate that 12 billion metric tons of plastic waste will accumulate on the planet by 2050. And that is certainly going to be a problem and why we're here today. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Cara. That's great. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are lots of really interesting details there, but what I'm getting is, plastic is everywhere. The situation is extremely alarming, and if we carry on the current trajectory, things are going to get a whole lot worse. Ramesh, what we're doing at the moment isn't working. How are we going to make the radical changes needed to start having an impact? What are the concrete steps we need to make now?
Yeah, clearly it is, talk about clear and present danger. I mean, I think I would echo Kara's summary of how bad the situation is. And now it is time that we come together to look at what are the solutions and what are the hurdles to solve this problem, right? Because it is, we obviously need to solve this 2 years ago if we had our druthers right. And I've always framed it from both a scientific standpoint and an economic standpoint because of my background, that thermodynamics and economics have to work together to solve this. If not, people are going to find creative ways and the problem is just going to get passed on to another generation. The good news is, from the thermodynamic standpoint, the solution exists, right? You have mechanical recycling, you have chemical recycling, and in both those cases, you can pretty much go back to producing whatever material you want to produce from collecting the plastic that is leaching out into the environment or ending up in landfills. So the collection and sorting infrastructure that is still being set up absolutely needs to accelerate to the point that plastic waste never goes to a landfill at all. So why is it going to a landfill today? And that is where economics comes into play, that if you look at the money, because at the end of the day, there has to be a financially sustainable solution to this. Otherwise, we're just going to be harping on how big a problem this is, but the right kind of investors are not going to move in here. And then once again, we are going to have to rely on governments moving. And don't forget, governments at the end of the day will have to work with societies that are going to be impacted, whatever decisions they make. On the financial side, if you look at where we are today, I believe there is reason to be optimistic because the end users and the producers are going to be forced to pay, and the end users are willing to pay a much higher price for recycled content than virgin resin. And that is the perfect match. What we need to make sure happens right away is that these facilities, these mini facilities, I would say, not world scale facilities, because waste is a municipal issue and not a scale issue. You cannot build a world scale waste treatment plant in Germany and expect to take care of the waste from Poland. Each municipality will have to build these recycled facilities where the plastic that is recycled from that society comes in. It's mechanically recycled if you're making packaging that is non-food grade related. It's chemically recycled if you're making it food grade related. Just to throw some numbers at you to make sure that we realize that the optimism is well placed. At the end of the day, the chemical industry, especially when it makes plastic, starts with the ethylene molecule, right? The cost to make ethylene today, even at these reasonably high oil prices and pretty high gas prices, ethane prices, if you will, is give or take somewhere around $450 to $550 a ton. Yeah, that is ethylene. Now that has to be polymerized, obviously, to make plastic. If you look at the trade price of plastics today, whether it's linear low or high density polyethylene, is somewhere between $1,600 to $2,000 a ton. And the conversion cost is only about $200. So the margin to make plastic from recycled content, where the waste is essentially, I would say, you can't say free, there is obviously a cost to collect waste plastic, is very, very high, even if you're going to sell recycled plastic at today's market prices. So in today's world, with the technology also being solved, there are 3 or 4 technologies that I think are very viable. there is absolutely no excuse for any municipality to not allow these recycling facilities to be built. So
Ramesh,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I hear you, and it's a very compelling argument that you're putting forward about the economics of recycling. And I get the point you're making that there's a high demand for high quality recycled plastic, but these are recycled ideas. We've been hearing these promises about recycling. I've been hearing them for years. People have been hearing them for decades. And there's always a new twist on, oh, this time the economics will work, and this time there's the will and the willingness. Isn't it time that we stop looking at end of pipe solutions and stopped hearing the regurgitated promises of we've got new technology? Chemical recycling technology is not new. It's been around for a long time. It's been tried. It's failed before. Maybe it'll work in the future. Maybe it'll make breakthroughs. All types of recycling can have incremental benefits and can improve. But recycling is not, we're not going to recycle our way out of this crisis, are we? Isn't it time we start looking at the origin of this problem, as Gabriel was alluding to earlier?
See, single-use plastics obviously can easily be banned and replaced. Okay, I see no reason why, from a policy standpoint, that entire gamut of use of plastics can be eliminated through discipline and policy, and through all of us being active with governments to make sure that that is implemented across the globe. For the life of me, I don't understand why that is taking as long as it is, and it clearly needs to be done. But in the world of packaging, if you look at whether it's food, whether it's medical applications, whether it's rigid plastic use, you cannot wish away the positives in terms of a packaging material that plastic brings to the table and assume that there is a more environmentally friendly and economically viable alternative. Today, that doesn't exist. So then you do have to develop an ecosystem where this material, after it is used, like, independent of, look at what is happening with the masks. The masks that we use today are some kind of a plastic material that is being used, right? Which is obviously helping the world from a pure COVID standpoint. So I think recycling as an option to address plastic waste has definitely reached an inflection point in my view. It is not similar to what was being talked about 10 years ago, because the pyrolysis technology that we are talking about today is very different than what we were talking about 10 years ago, because you can actually pyrolyze and crack to make virgin plastic today, and that is relatively new. On mechanical recycling, and I agree with you, but there I think we have been remiss in how far we have pushed industry, and from a regulatory standpoint where mechanical recycling should have been at a much higher level. And their EPRs, where we ask the producers to pay, is obviously an incentive to force producers to make material from recycled material. What I would really like to see though, Joe, I think that will make a huge difference is we need to attack it at the source, you're right, but the source is not just reducing production. The source, in my view, is to attack virgin pellets from getting out of countries or getting into countries. If we make sure that virgin plastic will always contain a certain amount of recycled plastic, I think we will make a huge difference very, very quickly, but that's a regulatory issue that we need to look at.
Okay, thanks, Ramesh. Kara, you're looking at this so close up and seeing the damage, and you've been studying that for so long now. What's your thoughts? Where do you see the solution coming from? It seems to me we can't wait too much longer, hoping for things to get better. What are 2 or 3 things that you would like to see happen, tomorrow?
But yeah, I think I don't disagree with a lot that Ramesh was saying in terms of, recycling has to be a piece of this solution. I do think that there were some broad brush statements there about the feasibility and the practicability of what's available today with mechanical recycling and chemical recycling. I also agree that there are products that we need to think about whether or not the use of plastic is necessary in their application. I don't think we can broadly say single-use plastics must be banned, but there are certainly instances, like in the case of cosmetic microbeads, where everybody can pretty much agree that that's not necessary. We can find a replacement. So we need to find those low-hanging fruits. I think we need to encourage behavior change in that sense of sort of decreasing our reliance on the single use and throwaway. But some of the work that I've participated in has shown that even if we do those things and if we improve waste management infrastructure globally, given the current trends, we simply are not going to make a dent in this problem unless we also address the amount of plastic waste we produce. So that may mean we need to reduce production, full stop. If you stop making it, there's no waste to manage. It could also mean making different materials that can be fully recaptured and reused, as opposed to today's plastics, where we can get perhaps a degraded form of recycled material out of these carbon-carbon backbone polymers that are very hard to reprocess, right? So perhaps we can make new materials that truly are circular. So I think we need to do lots of things at the same time. We need to be working in the very short term to improve the kinds of packaging we decide not to use and we decide to use, and redesigning the packaging we use so that it can be handled in existing waste management infrastructure. But we also need to be simultaneously investing in R&D on new materials that have a clear design for management and end of life, which ideally would be full recapture and then reuse in some valuable upcycling or at least equivalent use application.
Yeah, the one
thank you.
that
Ramesh, I'll give you 20 seconds. I'm being tapped on the shoulder here, so we need to wrap up.
No, I want to reinforce a key point that Kara made on design, because today I think a lot of finished products, because of multi-layers and multiple plastics, are making it a lot harder for them to be recycled, and design, I think, is going to play a key role in making them successful.
Ramesh, Kara, thank you very much. I think we've come up with plenty more for other people to get stuck into. So now I'm going to hand over to Chris Serio, a senior consultant at Resource Recycling Systems, a material management consulting company based in Michigan, who will take us on to the next session.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks Planet Tracker for putting this event together. So I'm glad to introduce Greg Fleming, as Gabrielle noted, President and CEO of Rockefeller Capital Management. Greg joined Rockefeller after serving as president of Morgan Stanley Wealth Management and Morgan Stanley Investment Management. And prior, he was president and chief operating officer of Merrill Lynch. A fellow Colgate graduate, Greg also has a law degree from Yale University. So just pause here that we have a Greg Fleming, a global finance leader, joining this Planet Tracker event, in my mind, really underscores the rapid conversion of finance and investing with plastics and ESG. And so I think one thing we'll all agree upon, especially the team at Planet Tracker, is that institutional and retail investors in the broader investment sector has a role and can play a pivotal role by valuing and investing in companies that are making the shift to more sustainable plastics production and management across the supply chain. So again, it's a great pleasure that Greg is here to join us. Greg, we look forward to your remarks on the role of capital markets, and I'll draw on the title of the event today, the role of capital markets with ESG and the global plastic supply chain. So thanks so much for your close attention and for your time today. Welcome, Greg.
Great, Chris. Thanks very much, Chris Serio, who I've known a long time and passionate on the topic. Thanks to Planet Tracker, the CFA Institute, and all those involved in putting this program together. It's a terrific program. At Rockefeller Capital Management, sustainable investing is core to what we do. And this topic, plastics, is a critically important one. The phrase impact investing was actually coined at Rockefeller Foundation in 2007, one of our sister organizations. And the Rockefeller family have been focused on ESG for literally decades. They were and are truly pioneers in the space. Today, I'll set the stage. That was what I'd intended to say. It sounds like already 20 minutes in, there's detailed substantive dialogue from people who are truly experts in the space on the program. I wanted to talk through three major themes and then focus on where we go from there. And those themes, again, are intended to be a framework that will allow the follow-on conversations to flow from. So the three themes I wanted to talk about are: one, plastics are a major challenge, to state the obvious, but I want to run through that. 2, this is a societal and global problem. Solutions will involve all of us. And 3, investors play a pivotal role in effectuating change. And as Chris said, that's part of the reason that I'm here. And it's part of what we do at Rockefeller Capital Management. So let's start with the first theme focus area, and that's that plastics are a challenge. The world has woken up to the problematic volume of plastic waste. Pictures of sea turtles with straws and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch are just some of the images that help bring this to light. The reality is that many of us, probably most of us as individuals, have experienced the plastic phenomenon today, whether it's swimming somewhere and seeing plastic or walking by water somewhere and seeing plastic. We all recognize that this is, in fact, a challenge. The scientific experts, many in the lineup today, will tell us more about the facts, but they are alarming. Every year, 8 million metric tons of plastic flow into the ocean. By 2050, there could be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Plastic has been discovered in fish, animal feed, sea salt, and many other things we eat. And in fact, there's enough plastic out there already that you can measure it and note it in people that eat a certain amount of fish. It's something that is remarkable to even think about or say. Some of these plastics are reducing fertility in humans and other mammals. So those are the facts. And one of the speakers earlier talked about the fact that it's going to become more challenging from here. There is an upside from plastics. It has helped human society develop in many ways. Plastic does protect food, minimize food waste, and therefore allow us to get it out and around to more people. Plastic has made the production of many things ranging from medical devices to computers cheaper, and therefore more accessible to millions of people. The lightweight nature of plastics has many positives, including reducing the carbon footprint of transporting goods because they weigh less, and therefore you're utilizing fewer fossil fuels to move those goods around. So there is a balance to be struck here. There's no question. But the first theme, plastics are a challenge. Theme number 2, this is a societal and global problem. The solutions involve all of us. We need to create behavioral change among millions, if not billions of people. We need to modify our use of plastic, which involves recycling the plastic that we use and using the plastic we recycle. It involves eliminating plastic we don't need, and in some cases, switching to other materials. Now, there are a number of entities along the value chain that can and must work together. So we can start with non-governmental entities. NGOs are driving important change. Collaborative initiatives like Alliance to End Plastic Waste and the Recycling Partnership are bringing companies and municipalities across the value chain together. Organizations like Planet Tracker are producing excellent research on the topic. As you saw, and Ellen MacArthur Foundations are pushing companies to reduce unnecessary plastic and transition to biodegradable and recyclable plastic. For example, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation New Plastics Economy has been very effective at getting companies to set targets for shifting to recyclable, reusable, or compostable plastic by 2025. Corporations. Companies are adapting by setting targets to increase their use of sustainable plastic, which helps drive change along the value chain. Brands are redesigning their products, changing material specifications, and even changing business models. Plastic manufacturers like Amcor, who we will be hearing from later today, are helping brands meet their targets. Waste collectors and recyclers are improving their ability to collect, sort, and sell. Third entity along the value chain, governments. Governments have a role too, helping to speed these processes with regulation where it's required, such as by taxing virgin resin, which we're seeing in Europe. All of these entities along the value chain are part of the solution. Second theme, it's a societal and global problem, and the solutions involve all of us. Third theme is investors can play a pivotal role, and they must. First, from a research standpoint, change brings new risks and opportunities for investment. This means identifying companies at the forefront of the plastics transformation that are supported by three tailwinds. A, changing regulation. Taxes on virgin resin in Europe and plastic pollution bills being considered by US states may accelerate the transition to post-consumer recycled content and alternative materials. B, changing consumer preferences. A significant number of consumers are changing their purchasing preferences based upon sustainability. Consumers practice sustainability-led behavior in their daily life, minimizing food waste, using energy-efficient appliances, and in their shopping behavior, preferring products with minimal packaging. They attribute positive emotions such as feeling happy when buying sustainable products, which shows the potential for sustainability to impact customer experience, happiness, and loyalty. Now, I'm raising 3 children in their 20s, and I can tell you that the millennials and Generation Z are absolutely adopting these changing customer preferences, and they're not going to go back or change again as they get older. They feel it, they live it, and they mean it. C, from a research standpoint, technological advancements. As always, innovation is key, ranging from the development of biodegradable plastics to new ways of breaking down plastic molecules and reconstituting them into new food-safe packaging products with chemical recycling. That leads me to engagement, second part of what investors can do. Investors are also becoming more proactive about asking companies to accelerate changes where they are lagging. At Rockefeller Asset Management, we regularly get on the phone with companies that we own to discuss the pace at which they are transitioning away from virgin resins, demand from their customers for more sustainable alternatives, their ability to meet that demand, and what they're doing to position themselves as leaders in a more sustainable future. For example, we talk to companies that use plastic packaging about steps they're taking to update their packaging to more sustainable alternatives. We talk to packaging makers about linking executive compensation to transition targets to ensure they are leading their peers as demand shifts. We talk to recyclers about the pace of their investments in sorting technology. Last year, we launched an ocean engagement fund in partnership with Credit Suisse. Together with the Ocean Foundation, we are engaging with companies along the plastics value chain to improve ocean health, including by asking them to take steps to reduce plastic waste that may flow into the ocean. So where do we go from here? I just highlighted the challenge, solutions, and implications for investors. Transformative change is underway, I believe. I would encourage you to reference resources such as individual companies' progress submissions to the Ellen MacArthur Fund, New Plastic Economy Initiative, and of course, Planet Tracker's research on plastics. We will soon be posting a position at Rockefeller Asset Management for an experienced engagement analyst. This role will help scale our engagements with underlying companies on issues such as plastic pollution and ocean health. But we're not alone in this. The investment industry will increasingly position itself to do important work of this kind. Hopefully, you will leave today inspired with new ways to think about how the environmental pressures and changing trends in the plastics value chain pose both risks and opportunities for investment decisions. On this topic, we need a big group, ultimately all of us. I think we can get there. I have words of incredible people from the past to inspire us. Margaret Mead said the following, quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Nelson Mandela said the following, "It always seems impossible until it is done." And Albert Einstein said, quote, The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Thank you for having me here. Have a great conference on a very important topic. All the best.
Thank you, Greg. I think your comments were profound and spot on. And it's just nice to have a pause there to really reflect on what you've shared. I know that many of us are really moved by what you've shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On to the next panel, plastics everyday, production, use, and waste. And on this panel, we have Conrad McCarran. He's the Senior Vice President of As You Sow. We have Courtney Lawrence, Managing Director, Sustainable Banking and Corporate Transitions for Citi. We have Dominic Charles, Director of Finance and Transparency, No Plastic Waste, Minderoo Foundation. And we have David Clark, Vice President, Sustainability for Amcor. Ms. Eunice Heath unfortunately cannot attend today due to last-minute scheduling issues, and she sends a very warm welcome to everybody on the panel. So today's panel, we're going to have a quick back and forth conversation, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, going back and forth on a bunch of ideas. What are we going to do? And so Dominic, over to you. You've just published a great paper. Let's make sure you put it in the chat box on the Plastic Waste Makers Index and single-use plastics. So what's your 45 seconds, 1 minute, of what we can do over the next 4 or 5 years?
Thanks, Gabrielle. Yeah, so look, I think it all starts with single-use plastics, right? So that's the everyday items like bags and straws, but primarily packaging. Together, these applications count for 1/3 of all plastics produced by mass, the kind of largest single plastics application. And single-use plastics account actually for the majority of marine litter. And that's primarily through mismanaged municipal solid waste, especially in the global south. But I think that the really important thing to know is that currently 98% of these plastics are made from virgin fossil fuels. So the economies of scale that the petro and chemical industry enjoys that is creating this economic imbalance. That means that the alternatives to single-use plastics, so reuse models, substitutes, recycling, just currently cannot reach scale. And we expect that actually over the next 5 years, the industry is going to add 30% additional virgin capacity for these polymers. And that's confirmed and likely projects. So it is kind of business as usual coming down the pipe. And that is actually just going to see the problem get worse before it gets better.
So if it's business as usual, I mean, Conrad, you've done all sorts of engagement over the years with petrochemical companies and others, and you've had some recent success. What was the nature of that success? How did you help Dow and others see the light, if you would? What's your secret so we can mimic you?
Thank you and good morning. I think that we try to look ahead at the risks that are out there and educate companies that they need to step up. In the case of some of the petrochemical companies, Dow and some of its peers, ExxonMobil, we looked at plastic pellets, which are a growing supply chain problem and estimated to be about the second largest direct source of microplastic pollution. And we looked out at the plans that they had. The industry said it had a plan, Operation Clean Sweep, but there was no public reporting, unbelievably, after 20 years. And so it seemed like a no-brainer that there should be public disclosure by companies about how much is being spilled. So educating people and transparency, I think, are really basic activities that we bring to the table. And I think we've helped open up that area so that now there is some reporting by the big major petrochemical producers.
So does that reporting help impact investment strategies you might have and how to on lending or engaging with your clients? Or what type of reporting do you need from us?
Absolutely. And thanks, Gabriel. I definitely think that these disclosures are the foundation by which investment decisions are made, largely. And one of the things that I wanted to ask Conrad, you know, from an organization like As You Sow, which I'm a big admirer of, do you think that the PRI's engagement guidance, you know, there's been a lot written recently, guidance to investors on engagement and stewardship strategies. Is that enough, or how can we really start to move capital flows away from plastics and into more sustainable materials?
That's a great question. The information the PRI is providing is a blueprint of how to engage with companies, but to this point, we don't see a lot of public direct engagement. Now, Greg just told us that Rockefeller's on the phone with these companies and pushing for change, and so that's great to hear. So it's great to hear that privately, a lot of investors are pushing companies. What As You Sow does is basically flip that and do it very publicly to add an element of responsibility and pressure. And so the work we've done, especially with the consumer goods side, trying to get companies to recycle more, to take responsibility for their packaging, I think there's no excuse for not being out there now and pushing very hard, because all of what you've heard from the scientists is that there's no time to waste. And I think the most important point to make perhaps is we have to look beyond incremental change, even though we're struggling with that, and look at systemic change. And I think that's, you know, what the Pew study, which we should be talking about, that was a great message. We really need to be bold and push for systemic change.
So, but how do we help a company like Amcor? I mean, if I'm at Amcor, I'm sorry, Dave, I know you well. I think I'm feeling a bit squeezed in the middle. You know, you have these large names upstream, you know, and then there's Amcor, and then there's the big names downstream, and you're just a service provider. How do we help Amcor, you know, move forward in the refill and reuse space? What do you need from us, Dave?
I mean,
that's our marching orders.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we are feeling squeezed, but we also see it's a great opportunity both for business and for impact. So, you know, we look at it as we're manufacturers of packaging for the products that people buy, and our main job, as you've heard before, is protecting those products so that they're safe and fresh and minimizing waste when consumers use them. And over time, plastics have turned out to be a great material for packaging to do everything except solve that end of life issue. So, you know, we see the opportunities first and foremost as being the packaging experts. How do we design that packaging so that it can be recyclable? We're certainly spending a lot of effort on looking at what are the potential reuse models there could exist. We do some beverage bottles today. That's a growing part of our business. But if you look at the grocery store and you look what people are buying in their carts, how much of that is really going to change over to, you know, reuse, and would that be manageable? And the same with compostability. There are certainly opportunities. We make some compostable packaging, but we don't see a wholesale shift. So it is going to be multiple levers that we need to pull. Certainly recycling needs to be part of that. And maybe to say differently what Courtney said, we're not so much looking at how do we move away from plastics, but how do we use plastics responsibly where they're the best material and where they're appropriate. Certainly we need to work with the brands and the folks downstream who are buying our products. We need to work with our suppliers, and just as importantly, we need the infrastructure in place. We need to work with the governments to develop the right policies to support recycling. We need to work with waste management companies and recyclers, because recycling isn't free. You heard about the disadvantage of making recycled material versus virgin material. Landfilling in most places is still a lot cheaper than recycling. And until we can find ways to fix the economics, then it's going to be really difficult to move toward the circular economy that we all want to move to. But we see it as a huge opportunity.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Dave, absolutely agree with you. As it was coming out of my mouth, I was thinking, you know, it's not the material plastic that's the problem. It's the end use. It's the linear path.
Right.
One thing that occurred to me as you were speaking is that, you know, I'm based in London, and we see a lot of fantastic, like a lot of fantastic support from the EU coming out, whether it be the EU Green Deal or the EU taxonomy. What occurred to me was that the EU taxonomy as it stands now doesn't address sustainable packaging or design or all of those elements that companies like Amcor should be rewarded for. I mean, we are seeing a lot of, on the London Stock Exchange Group, if you are a listed company that has activities, green revenues that align with the taxonomy, you get the seal on your stock. And a lot of portfolios are being constructed around that, but it doesn't include sustainable packaging or design. And so that's something that I'd be keen to hear from others. Again, how we can push to get the financial flows moving towards more sustainable, a circular system.
Yeah, if I can comment, I think you're absolutely right. The taxonomy as a tool itself for investors doesn't specifically address plastic waste, and maybe touches on circularity if you look at products and more sustainable products. There are some other avenues in terms of the EU circular economy directive, which are much more specific, and I think there are ways for companies to look at or investors to look at our companies adopting their strategies to be able to work within those directives and creating more circular business models, but it's not in the taxonomy yet.
If I can add, I think it's no coincidence that Plastics Europe, the kind of industry body for the petrochemical industry in Europe, has just recently committed themselves to the 30% minimum recycled content by 2030, right? That is, pretty much in line with the EU's own, emerging regulations. And I think we need to see the visibility, both for industry, both for financial markets, for shareholders, on what is coming down the policy pipeline in order to, move the money in the right direction. I mean, it's not as simple as policymakers lead. Industry needs to be pushing in the right direction. The markets need to be pushing policymakers for the right policies. But I think, until we have that visibility, on the kind of, the 5-10 year time horizon, we won't see meaningful amounts of capital move.
Yeah, Dom, I'm smiling when you say the 5-year, 10-year. Courtney and Dave have been on panels with me, and I keep always asking, well, what do we do in 2022 and 2023? And I get told, can't ask those questions. That's about investor relations. So no one from investor relations is on the panel today, so I think we're okay. But exactly, what are we going to do? Conrad, you've done a lot of thinking about, do we just need to decrease the absolute amount of plastic that we make?
Absolutely. I think the other crucial point that's been missing here is that the plastic supply chain messaging of the petrochemical industry is nearly all about fixing, recycling, and reducing waste, not about reduction. And, the resin manufacturers need to face up to the reality that the industry must substantially reduce the amount of single-use plastic generated starting now. I really recommend the Pew Trust report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, for so many reasons. But one of the key things is that it calls for brand owners and retailers to reduce at least 1/3 of plastic demand through elimination and reuse and new delivery models to reach an 80% reduction of ocean plastic waste by 2040. And it has a note that one of the most crucial roles that governments and investors can play in the coming years is to act to curb the planned expansion of plastic production. So we have to add reduction in there. And that's what we're not hearing from the petrochemical industry at this point, or the plastic manufacturers, the packaging manufacturers either.
Yeah, no, exactly, Conrad. I know we've talked about that a bit offline. Of course, Dominic, you did an enormous amount of work on that with the Plastic Waste Makers Index. I just keep on thinking, the utilization rate globally for the 5 key plastics, PET, polyethylene, and polyprop, is about 65%. And by 2025, the utilization rate may be 60% or 58% with all the added additions. There's estimates in there. So the sector is at overcapacity right now, but that's not the story they want us to know. Regardless of how much plastic we do use, I don't know. What does your research tell us about utilization rates, or what can you talk about that, Dom? When you're looking forward.
Yeah, without getting into kind of specific kind of company level utilization rates, I think one of the real challenges here is at the kind of geopolitical level, right? Like if we look at where the growth has come from in terms of polymer production, it's from fracked gas in the US, it's from gas in Russia, and it's from gas in the Middle East, and that there's the markets for energy and potentially transport are in decline. So it's no wonder that they're looking for alternatives, and plastics is a growth market. So I think the real scary thing is that even if we get our act together in Europe or in the US and manage our plastic better and increase more plastics and circularity, the growth markets for the new capacity are going to be in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia, which are those that have the real waste management challenges. So there is like a kind of complex global problem here that there are talks of a global treaty, but I'd be interested to know what folks on the panel think about the prospect for that.
Well, let's pivot. Yeah, exactly. Let's pivot to just the downstream, all the way downstream. What do we do about incineration? Obviously, as Joe Brock's recent research, special report that I hope he posts, or someone can post in the chat box. Our chat box is on fire, which is great. His report for Reuters highlighted how some plastics recycling in the United States was being used in cement kilns, and that plastic waste is often a key feedstock for cement kilns. What do we do about incineration, and particularly in Europe, where incineration is plastics and incineration of plastics is a key feedstock for energy in the EU?
I think that, Gabrielle, the incineration developed as an alternative to landfill, and typically, if you look at people's waste management hierarchies, incineration is just above landfill and 2 steps above leakage into the environment. And as we can come up with better solutions in terms of creating more circularity, keeping those materials in play, reducing the amount of virgin materials we need because we can either reuse or recycle, then I think our challenge is how do we put those incinerators out of business or diminish them, or certainly keep the valuable plastics out and convert the plastics that aren't valuable into more valuable ones over time.
Dave, you said it, I agree 100%. It's a mass balance issue. We have 100 tons coming in the system, 5 tons, 6 tons being recycled. The other 95 tons are just sort of floating around, being put in landfills or incinerated or end up in the ocean. And it's a valuable product. It's like throwing gold away,
Yeah, Gabriel, it is like gold, and I just have to share. I moved to London from Beijing, where there was, until recently, until I think 2 years ago, maybe even 18 months ago, there was no recycling program, not really, in China, and that's starting to change. And one of the things we're looking at is inclusive finance, with ways to help your average, person on the street financially benefit from collecting and recycling. And we're looking at that in China, but it's also, I think it's applicable anywhere where the collection systems are lacking, where the infrastructure is lacking, where particularly, and I think there's some great comments in the chat box around the global South and Africa. As someone who's focused on the emerging markets, these are the areas that waste management is not, it's just not present in a lot of these places. And Dominic, to your point, I think a treaty is needed, particularly because some of this is going to require funding. So the World Bank and a lot of the development banks, they already fund waste management, sanitation in these countries, but let's really push it through a global treaty. I think that's a great idea.
Go ahead, Dom. It looks like you're about to say something.
Actually, I wouldn't say that I'm skeptical about a global treaty, but I'm skeptical about the timeline which anything meaningful can happen, and especially the the chances of a treaty being kind of ratified, you know, by the US and by China, you know, in the short term, you know, I think it feels like we're going to have to rely on domestic regulation to really kind of take the lead. I think, you know, there are great things happening in Europe. We see actually hear about great things happening in places like Kenya, you know, bringing in mandatory PR schemes, you know, kind of, you know, gram for gram, you know, taxes on virgin, paying for subsidies on recycled content. So I think, you know, I think that's where I think in the short term, you know, certainly the 5-year horizon, it feels like the most progress is going to be made.
Well, thinking about, I mean, maybe one thing is for us to not necessarily have a treaty, but work collectively. So Courtney and Conrad, I mean, one thing we could, this is a eye in the sky or pie in the sky idea. Sorry, we could work on removing financing problematic plastics, especially like polyvinyl chloride. You know, that we don't necessarily need polyvinyl chloride always for windows and doors. There are other materials that we could use, and maybe that's something that we don't have to expand into emerging markets. Do you have any thoughts on that, Conrad?
Right. There's already industry alignment to phase out problematic chemical plastics like PVC and polystyrene, styrofoam, expanded polystyrene. And I think companies must really rapidly take bold action to achieve high levels of recycling of problematic plastics at scale, or they need to begin to switch to other formats. What we're seeing right now, the multi-material flexible packaging area, sachets and pouches, that's a prime example. Those are all part of a commitment that companies have made to make these materials recyclable by 2025 under the Ellen MacArthur Global Commitment process, or they're supposed to be phased out. That's, you know, that's a very short timeline. It's very unlikely these materials have a chance of being recycled by 2025. So I think brands need to decide whether to pour billions of dollars into a collection and processing system that may or may not work, or begin to move away from these complex types of flexible packaging that have great benefits, but are almost always ending up as trash, burned or landfilled.
Yeah, if I can build on that, Conrad, and maybe some history for people who may not be familiar with this. I mean, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation first started looking at what are the barriers to recycling and creating a circular economy for packaging. And one of the things they came up with is, you know, this flexible packaging that was made by laminating different types of non-compatible materials together made something that's essentially not recyclable. And until we can stop doing that, we're not going to be able to create, you know, scalable systems for recycling flexible packaging. So industry came together with the global commitment. Now I think companies making about 80% of all of the plastic packaging around the world have signed on to this. And the companies may not be doing their own recycling at that point, but it's sending a strong signal to recyclers, to governments and waste management companies that by 2025, our goal is, number one, this packaging will be recyclable. Now we have to get the infrastructure in place and help educate consumers. It's not sufficient in itself redesigning the package, but it's a necessary first step. And we're moving on that, you know, rapidly at Amcor, introducing new products almost every quarter, and working with customers to get those products to market. But there's still another part that needs to be done, and that's where beyond brands, I mean, we need to get governments, whether it's government policy and driven through the UN or extended producer responsibility regulations, which we're starting to see come on board in the United States to help fund recycling. That's the other part that needs to come together to create that circularity here.
Yeah, I really think the producers, though, need to step up here. It's not up to waste management to figure out how to process or invent a technology that will process these materials. It has to be the companies that put them on the market or the companies that upstream design them. They're the ones who need to be responsible, and I don't see them really invested in that. We can't just wait to say, well, regulators need to deal with it or waste management companies. It really needs to be the people who put this out on the market that need to lead on looking for solutions.
Interesting. I mean, one idea is, how do we build in recycling and reuse and refill throughout the whole supply chain? In other words, if we look at mass balance, you know, if I vent chemicals, you know, when I'm turning off a factory, turn off a production site, or cleaning up a site, all the way to, you know, the extra plastic on the shop floor, to the extra plastic I throw out here, to the plastic that ends up in waste, that's all waste. I mean, I mean, an efficient financial engineer would look at that and say, hey, wait a moment, why are you throwing away so much money? And so how do we look at the whole system instead of thinking it's this step, it's this step, it's this step, and say it's the whole system that we need to adjust towards sustainability? Because otherwise, I worry that yes, we'll have some, we'll make headway in plastics, but then everyone's going to pivot to paper, and then we have problems in the paper sector. Replace plastic with paper.
I mean, that's certainly one of the risks, because as you look at substituting plastics with other materials, every one has impacts. Even the Pew report said if we followed their guidance to using more paper packaging, I think it puts 11% more pressure on forests around the world to create enough paper for the packaging. So there will be consequences of any choice that's made. I think you see the same with reuse. I mean, looking at what's the carbon footprint of bringing packages back and cleaning them versus recycling is something else that has to be considered. So we're looking at all of these different levers and trying to find out how do you minimize impact, and the more efficiently you can create markets by internalizing the cost of those externalities, whether it's extraction, sending waste to landfill, or carbon, then you're going to have businesses making much better choices about the products that they can offer.
And this is where consumers come in. Consumers really have to shift their behavior. Some of us have gotten so spoiled with this convenience culture, and we have to give up the single-use throwaway mentality and be willing to carry our reusables, to go into Starbucks in the future and be able to pick up a reusable cup, take it with you and bring it back, and begin to live a world where we're using less resources. And so if consumers will lead in that area, the companies will certainly follow.
I'm just going to come in, and I don't know how much time we have, Gabriel, but one thing I'd like to, not to pivot slightly, but I'll pivot slightly, which is to say that, in terms of a financial system that is fit for purpose for a circular economy, we have to really start addressing circularity. And one of the things that we highlight to our clients as an investment bank is the 10-fold increase in circular economy funds, which is fantastic. Mostly enlisted equities. And that was a report, the report that the MacArthur Foundation, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation put out. But it still really doesn't address the whole, the full value chain, and really the increase in resins and in virgin plastics. One other tool in the toolbox that I love is the Morgan Stanley Index that was released earlier this year, that is essentially an exclusion. It allows investors to exclude companies based on plastics exposure. But again, I'm not, I'd love to see more tools, more indices that allow investors to take other strategies to incentivize companies that are, again, having good design, good packaging design that reduces any raw materials. And I'm curious, maybe Conrad or David or Dominic, any of you, if you want to comment on some of the tools that the financial system needs to really redirect capital flows.
Well, first, picking up on your last point, we've done original research at As You Sow, where we rank the sustainability of the packaging of 50 major companies on things like packaging design and commitment to reuse and recycle content and producer responsibility. So we are putting the heat on these companies by asking them these key questions and then grading and ranking those indicators, and then acting on them, engaging with them, and filing proposals if possible. So I think that kind of activity really puts them on notice. It makes them uncomfortable, and that's part of the point, is to have them realize that there are now huge numbers of investors who believe they are not moving fast enough, not rapidly enough. And I think once they get that message, then the financial side can swing in and say, oh, there is a need here now for all of these new products, perhaps blended financing. I think we're going to see all sorts of opportunities, but we have to look carefully at them and make sure that these solutions are systemic and that they blend well with the existing infrastructure, and that they really deal with the issues without creating other issues. So I think part of it is getting used to saying we're in a system here, and we have to really be very attuned that all of these activities that we're going to finance are going to harmonize and improve those systems and make them more efficient.
Yeah, I keep thinking, sorry to jump in, Dom. I keep thinking about the green bonds and ESG simulated loans that Courtney and I talk a lot about. It's like, I know it's starting a little bit in the plastics, containers, and packaging sector. It's the petrochemical space is far behind, but they're starting to look. I mean, we need to retool industry, and I think it's such an opportunity with 70% of the debt, being refinanced in the next by 2025. That's aligned with the 2025 EU policies, which are dictating much of the global sort of trends around sustainable plastic. I would think that that's a nice convergence. 70% of the debt's is being refinanced. 2025 EU policy on single-use plastic. You have amazing work that Dom can tell you about in a second that he's done, and it just highlights that there needs to be retooling of the industry. I also just am always struck that some firm out there is going to see how to make a lot of money doing the right thing in this space. They're going to brand, so they're going to brand not just the food, but they're going to brand their package. I'm going to have I'm going to be like proud. Look, I got packaging from Dave. Putting you a bit on the spot, and inside is like organic, whatever I'm eating that day. So what do you think, Dom? Dom? How about do you want to close this off for a bit for today? Lead us towards the close and pass to Raina.
I can try, and let me try and do that by going back to Courtney's questions on like what might be useful for for the markets. I think I agree with Conrad that it's complex and we require kind of system level answers, but I think there are a couple of metrics that would be kind of no regret for the markets and for regulators to know. And I think the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has done a great job in getting some voluntary reporting done on virgin versus recycled plastics. But I think that's the key one, right? And our work in our recent report kind of did it outside in. But effectively, we all agree that it starts with the production of plastics from fossil fuels, and that's what we kind of need to fix. And measuring that, which is kind of analogous to kind of scope 3 emissions in carbon, right? That's like the entirety of the problem. And if we can track how that is moving, and it needs to move in the right direction. It needs to decline rather than grow. And I think if we can get some kind of mandatory reporting from industry on virgin polymer production and use, and we can kind of track that, then we all actually have something that the markets can really use to go inform their own investments and push companies to act in different ways, and it will show the regulators whether policies are actually moving the needle or not.
That's great. Thank you, Dom. I'm sorry, as always, we have to stop early. I think we could talk for another 5 hours. Thank you so much, Conrad, Dave, and Courtney, and Dom. It's such a pleasure to host the 4 of you. And thank you, Eunice and Abstentia. And right now, we're going to pass on over to Raina, who's going to talk about what we're going to do next. Thank you so much. And everybody in the chat, keep chatting. This is great.
All right. Well, thank you, Gabriel. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Oh, good. Well, I was so enjoying that conversation, and I was just wanting to jump on the panel. I had so much to add. So anyways, I want to just thank you and Plastic Tracker, Planet Tracker for including me in this conversation. I'm going to be hosting the next panel, which is really going to be about solutions. And I'm hoping to bring the perspective of the CPG side of things. I live and breathe in kind of like the boots on the ground of CPG. I have a company called RCD Packaging Innovation, and we specialize in developing actually fully compostable, flexible film packaging for food products. And so it was really interesting to hear, I think it was David talking about one of the most challenging packaging formats that we're dealing with right now in terms of recyclability is these multi-layer laminates. And so a decade ago, when I got into packaging design, that became my focus. I said, how can we design these multi-layer laminates out of materials that will still function on existing assets and still work, have the right barrier properties that the brands need, but then are also designed to go away, because these are types of materials that can easily escape the system. And when they do, we want them to be not wreaking havoc. We want them to be adding nutrients to the cycle. And so that's what my expertise is. I work up and down the flexible film and packaging supply chain, from compounding specialty biopolymers, extruding films, printing, laminating, selecting the right adhesives, inks, all the way up to the brand side to make sure they are connected with leading materials and technologies available. So as you can see, I'm very passionate about looking at the alternatives to the traditional plastic material supply chain, or what I call the conventional plastic material supply chain. I feel like that is a material platform that, while it was designed brilliantly many decades ago, it was never designed with the end in mind. And actually, it's not really meeting the needs of society as we have it now. And so it's time to disrupt and really focus on innovating alternative materials. And I really do feel strongly that we have the capability, when we ask the right questions and we get our brilliant minds focused on the right parts of the problem, we have the capability of designing fully functional, bio-based and biodegradable materials that can serve for a big portion of what is currently in a single-use area. And so that's a big passion of mine. So I could blabber on all day, but I'm going to stop because we have a brilliant panel of people that I'm excited to learn from, because they have been studying different aspects of the solution when it comes to dealing with the plastic waste crisis. And one of the things I'll say is this: when we're thinking about the plastic waste crisis, I've heard a lot about design for recyclability and recyclability. Yes, we need to deal with the plastics and the conventional materials that are in our supply chains and our in our world now. That's one part of the puzzle. But we also need to look to innovation, because we have a lot of work to do to design reuse systems and design these new platforms of materials that are actually way better than the current plastics we're dealing with today. So with that, I will ask Steve to start pulling on our beautiful panelists. We have Ann Johnson, who's the Principal and Vice President of Global Corporate Sustainability for Resource Recycling Systems. We have Jody Russell, who is the Senior Public Affairs Manager for Packaging and Sustainability of Nestle. Sharon Levine, who I don't know if she was able to call in because she just called me, so I might be able to try to loop her in. Hopefully she'll be able to join us. She was the founder of Rise St. James. She lives just out of Louisiana, and she lives in a neighborhood where she's often dealing with a lot of the painful realities of when you live close to toxic plastic production facilities. So I hope she can join us. We also have Rick Lord, Head of Methodology Innovation, ESG Innovation and Analytics for S&P Global, and Courtney Asher-Thompson, the Executive Director of Global Sustainable Finance for Morgan Stanley. So I will, I'd love to start with you, Ann, and what I'll say is this. As we're working together, I want to make sure that people are using the chat function. I've been seeing a lot of activity happening there, so feel free to ask questions to our group, and if we don't get to the question, like Gabriel said, we will address it. But Ann, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you here today, and I know that you are living and breathing the recycling system and looking in what's working, what's not, and I would love for you to help us give some context around the world of recycling, specifically around plastic recycling. What are you seeing that's working, and what are you seeing that really could use some adjustment?
Well, I think I would probably start off with a lot of what's been presented already, maybe try to pull it together, which is that the world of recycling is really variable, especially as you look at global geographies. And I think as an investor community, as people who live in developed markets, we tend to have a first world perspective on how well recycling works. And I think actually we're bearing the consequence of that by not paying attention to really how poorly and underdeveloped both waste management and recycling infrastructure is in many emerging markets. So I would say that that's sort of, some of the big context is we have, I would say, developed markets that have very strong supportive recycling policies, and they tend to perform very well. We have developed markets like the US that don't have strong supportive policy, and we tend to perform pretty poorly. And then you have emerging markets that tend to have both a deficit of, waste management, recycling infrastructure, as well as lack of policy. And then that's where you see some really, major crises around plastics. So in combination, all of those things together make a pretty complex environment landscape for understanding plastic recycling. Oh, we lost.
Well, Jody, why don't you jump in, Jody?
Sure. I mean, if I think about framing the challenge, for us as Nestle, we look at this from a food and beverage lens. And for us, the first step is, of course, food preservation, food quality, and food safety. And we sell everywhere. We're in 186 markets. So every country's policies are actually relevant to how we shape the business in the long term. So it's about bringing together what is fit for purpose packaging to protect our food, and then what are the environmental concerns that we need to address as well. Because this is a big systems challenge. We have our customers who care very much about this, and they want to work with us. The retailers want to work with us to meet their sustainability objectives. We have 300,000 employees and their families who care a lot about this. Our consumers care, and we want to move with our consumers. And the regulators care about making a just transition as well. And lastly, our investors care. And there are really a lot of policies and industry practices that can help reshape the system of packaging food. And we're learning as we tackle the problems. So we have to be clear about what's in our scope to control and what's not in our scope to control, but what we can influence. So we look at how we can change our packaging without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. We've committed to net zero emissions by 2050 for our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And every packaging decision we make now takes into consideration the impact on our overall emissions. And some of the solutions we need to build are beyond our scope, as I mentioned. And so we're actually partnering with other groups like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and the Consumer Goods Forum to look at how we can collaborate with others to make proposals to change the system. I don't want to talk for too long initially, but I guess I'll make one comment, because one of our other panelists had commented on the UN Treaty on Plastic Pollution, which Nestle is active on. And we need to look fundamentally. Ooh, there's a terrible echo now. We think we need to look fundamentally at how we produce, we use, we reuse, and we dispose of plastic. And we think that a coordinated international response is absolutely necessary, and a UN treaty on plastic pollution can help us achieve this. This could align business and government behind a shared understanding of the causes of pollution. And we've done this before. We have the Montreal Protocol, the Basel Convention, the Minamata Convention. And so we look at how this treaty could harmonize regulatory standards. It could support the development of national targets and action plans. We could define some common metrics for measurement, as well as support innovation, infrastructure development, and also environmental cleanup. And we think there's a lot we can learn from the way the Paris Agreement was negotiated and implemented with the national action plans. And how can we call today for the opening of negotiations and at the same time support a multi-stakeholder process? so that everyone who has a stake in solving this is at the table, and we can really develop the base for robust national and municipal action plans that are going to reflect the needs on the ground. I think Anne spoke very eloquently to the 3 different archetypes of countries, and every country has unique challenges and every municipality is managing waste differently. We want to start now in addressing those conversations. So as the UN treaty dialogues will continue, we have the opportunity really to have very deep and broad engagement at the national level, defining a future that's the system we want to build, not the system that was developed by accident.
Oh, I love that. And can you hear me now? Is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Oh, wait, well, no, Jody, I love what you were saying there. And I do agree with you that we need to have a global agreement. And you sent me those links to the UN treaty earlier in our conversation. I really do think that is an important step forward, specifically around defining key terms. And one of the terms I think that needs to be defined is what classifies a material as recyclable. And I have my concerns around, has plastic proven that it actually is recyclable? And I think that materials should be able to show that there's enough, like at least 60% of the materials are coming back into the system and have economic value enough to keep pulling back into the system to be recyclable. And I'm not sure that plastics have proven that. So I'd be curious of what your thoughts are on how we can define metrics for our plastic producers to prove that this material is actually recyclable.
So Raina, if I reflect on that, there are a couple different levels. One level is designed for recycling. Has a packaging type been designed? So for example, it's a monomaterial or it meets certain fiber contents. Let's say if it's a paper, that it meets certain percentages of fiber. So it's actually accepted in a recycling stream somewhere. Then there's the next level, which is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation definition, which is recycling facilities exist for a population, 30% of the population of 400 million in a region. And that's the commonly used definition under the Ellen MacArthur Foundation global commitment. Then you see other communities that are looking at the definition of recyclability as there is a recycling facility that accepts X type of packaging material, a certain type of plastic, within a radius of X miles or kilometers. That's very much defined, let's say, by a national or a municipal regulation. And so when we look at what defines recyclable, it's a sticky question. And in a world where with various additives, colorants, etc., coatings, we might have 40,000 different types of plastic. The question is, how many different types of plastic do we want to develop recycling systems for? And what are the types of recycling technologies that are preferred?
Oh, I love that. And I want to get into the conversation about controlling the types of materials we let into the system. But before we do that, I want to just target that second definition, which is the Ellen MacArthur definition, which is similar to the way that the United States defines it. So in the Federal Trade, the Green Guides, the FTC, it's defined that a material is recyclable if 60% of households have access to collection of that material. But what we're seeing time and time again is that means that we'll get a bunch of MRFs, 60% of the material facilities to collect it, and then they'll sort it and they'll do a great job, but those bales will just sit there because the end markets do not exist or they're not strong enough to pull them through. And so I think there's an opportunity here to link the definition of recyclable to the strength of the end market for that particular type of material. And so maybe that's just something to think about, because we do have a mass balance issue to deal with here, where, you know, we have like this much material entering the stream and then this much material of an end market. How do we match those so that we reduce the types of materials coming in and we expand the size and the capacity of those real true end markets? And do you have some thoughts on how we can support end market development?
Sure. I just want to weigh in on the definitional piece a bit, because ISO has a definition. The Federal Trade Commission is really based on claims, and it's actually a bit more expansive. And that's what you see, is that it's not just having access to collection, but it has to be sorted and then remanufactured into a new product. And that actually is the Federal Trade Commission definition. And I think the German standard, minimum standard for recyclability is it has to displace virgin material. So I think what you see increasingly is more focus on expanding the definition to go the whole way to end markets. And there's a demand for greater transparency on that flow of materials, to your point. It just can't be segregated and baled, it has to go somewhere. So to your point about how do we grow end markets, I think that post-national sword, that has become a really relevant question because, and not just post-national sword, but with the new Basel Agreement, where we see the flow of import and export of scrap plastics between markets having a real, effect on reclaimers who don't have access to material anymore, and their systems may not be in place in certain markets to actually segregate and bale commodity plastics for reprocessing. So what we're seeing is a growth in sort of end market demand types of policy, and that would include things like recycled content mandates. I think we're also seeing growth in procurement policies for materials or products with recycled content. I think there's we also have demand side policies, but for end market development, that's really the things where we're going to grow or incentivize people to make investments in, processing technologies and products. So that in the US at least is starting to be at the federal level, but we certainly have states that are moving on these types of things as well as the EU.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate that. And Jody, I'd like to come back to you after we get a chance to hear from Sharon Levine. She was able to call in, and we're incredibly honored to have her. It was hard for her to call in because she's been dealing with not having electricity and Wi-Fi in her neighborhood because of the impacts of Hurricane Ida. So Sharon, are you on? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, well, welcome. It's an honor to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to be here with you all.
So I've read your story and I was incredibly moved by it. And you founded a movement in your community called Rise St. James. And I'd love for you to share your story with the audience, a little bit about, what called you to stand into this leadership role and why was this so important?
Well, it was important because we already have 12 facilities, refineries, industries in the 5th district where I live. And we had 9 in the 4th district. So when I heard Formosa was coming to St. James, 2 miles from my home, something inside of me changed. I felt like it would be a death sentence for us. After I found out about all the chemicals that will be emitted in the air, and all the people who have already died of cancer, we not knowing why they were dying so rapid. And then when I found out about the chemicals and I found out about all these industries, and I did my research, and then I found out I had autoimmune hepatitis. I went back and did my research, and it comes from industrial pollutants. Then I found out I had aluminum in my body. Now recently I found out I have lead in my body. We can't take anymore. So when this plant said they were coming and our governor approved it, something inside of me changed. I think it was the calling of God that changed me, because I was not active in anything in the community. All I did was taught school and raised my children, and I wasn't concerned about what was going on in the community. I wasn't concerned to the point where I was looking into anything. I just was living my life and thought I was living a wonderful life, but not knowing I couldn't drink the water. But I didn't associate it with the chemicals until people that work at the industry told me that they put benzene in our drinking water, and benzene is cancer causing.
Wow.
And a whole lot of more chemicals that have been being dumped into our drinking water, and all the chemicals that's in the air. I learned all these things since they announced for most of us coming in here.
That's like incredibly heartbreaking, Sharon, and I really appreciate you sharing those realities, because many of us aren't seeing that so up and close and personal. But you losing family members and dealing with your own health issues, you're dealing with the realities of the externalities of the production of this material. And we often don't talk about those true costs and how to calculate those. Those are, we have pretended like we can't figure that out now in this big data generation we live in. But, you know, I think you standing up as a leader and doing what you were able to do, you're playing a role that is you had to stand up where markets have failed, where policy has failed. And it's showing that how important community leadership is to be a key part to this puzzle and trying to fix this plastic pollution crisis. So thank you so much for your work. And so Sharon, how can we how can we support your efforts here? I think I believe there's a fund I can put into the link for you.
Yes. I forwarded you the link yesterday.
Okay.
But right now we're dealing with the hurricane. Hurricane Ida. It swept through St. James. It stayed here a while, and it just destroyed a whole lot of homes. A whole lot of roofs are off. And as I'm speaking right now, it's raining in my house right now. I was trying to mop up some of the water and put buckets and pour it up. When the bucket gets full, we dump it outside. The insurance people taking forever to come to check on us. The insurance adjuster came to my house Friday, and since he left, it's been raining, and my living room is beginning to mold. And I'm gonna have to find a place to stay. So I'm so glad I could be on a call with you. I really am, because a lot of calls I didn't get on, but I wanted to get on this one just to let you all know what's going on in St. James. We don't have internet service. We don't have TV service or anything like that. So we don't even know what's going on. So it's raining right now, but I'm sitting in my car. But I'm glad to be on here with all of you all to tell you all what's going on.
Sharon, thank you so much.
Ever since the hurricane, the industry has been polluting us even more. I have done live stream to let the public know. I call EPA. They've been polluting us even more because they're thinking that we are so busy dealing with the hurricane that we're not going to notice them. But I'm tired of having a sore throat. And other members are having sore throats. Other community members are having sore throats, going to the doctor. We have been to the doctor so much for sore throats. These ethylene oxide, all these stuff that they're emitting in the air. We are breathing these things. We pass by these facilities and we breathe it. They don't care. They just let it out on the people. And they're doing it more because they think that we are not watching them because of this hurricane. But we are watching them. And I'm going to keep on reporting on them because that's wrong. Instead of they help the community to rebuild, they're taking the opportunity to pollute. And we also have an oil spill. One of the tanks at Marathon spilled oil. And I took pictures of it. And it's somewhere. I don't know if somebody took the story. But it's awful. It's really bad out here. People are crying. I'm not crying, but I'm praising God and I'm thanking God that I'm still alive. But just like I said, the industry is killing us. It's not just a hurricane. The industry is poisoning us, polluting us, and something needs to be done.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. And hearing your voice and hearing your perspective and the realities that our fellow human beings are experiencing as a byproduct of this addiction to plastic that we have, it's super critical that we hear this and we understand that. So Sharon, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it.
So I'm going to get off now. If that's all you have for me, I'm going to get off because I'm going to go wipe up the water on my living room floor.
Okay, yes,
so
ma'am.
I thank you so much for letting me be on. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. All right, well, have a good, be safe out there.
I'll talk with you later. All right,
take care.
okay then. All right, bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye.
Well, thank you. That was incredible to hear that perspective. It's something we rarely hear, right? We can get into our engineering, like, does that polymer work on that line? And does that, how do we make this increased recyclability? But we often forget the realities of the externalities of this particular material flow. And so it was an honor to have someone be able to help us see that. And so I know we only have about 10 more minutes, and it's hard to pivot from that level of weight that Sharon just brought to us. Does anybody on the panel have anything they would like to say to respond to what Sharon has before we move on to some of what we can do from an investment strategy standpoint and some of our banking institutions? Okay, well, I would love to, taking all that into account, I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Rick, and what you're doing from the standpoint of ESGs and looking to begin to collect information from corporations to see how they're faring in the world of in addressing the plastic crisis. So can you speak a little bit to the work that you're doing and how you think it can help us move towards a more innovative future?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I guess certainly where I'm coming from is very far removed from the reality we just heard about. So where I come from is essentially the role of the data provider, essentially providing information and analytics to the investor community, but also to corporates to think about all sorts of environmental problems, including plastic, which has been a really topical one in recent years. And so what we try to do is to gather as much information as possible from companies, standardize that and make that available to our investor clients so that they can then develop their own strategies around engaging with companies to improve what they do on plastic and other environmental issues. And also to think about new investment strategies that maybe try to drive companies towards being more effective in the way they manage plastic and reducing some of those externalities that are so severe in many of these cases. I think the onus has really been on disclosure with companies for a long time, and that's really what drives a lot of these decision making in the investment community. And disclosure has always been a big problem. I think companies are often resistant to provide that information in many cases, and I think in the same way that we've seen in recent years, disclosure around climate change has really increased enormously. So there's, particularly in the last 3 to 5 years, companies are really competing to be more transparent, to set targets around climate change and what they're planning to do to solve that problem. That's really created, I guess, kind of a virtuous cycle where we have investors really interested in gathering that information. They're requesting it from companies, and companies are wanting to put that forward to demonstrate why they can be kind of a productive force in solving some of these problems. And I think that relationship between investors and companies can be something we can use to drive forward progress on plastic as well. There's clearly a lot of interest around investors, given that there are many risks for investors around plastic. And I think as that builds momentum, it's really going to drive companies to disclose more, and it's going to help us to make better decisions around investing on plastic.
No, I thank you, Rick, for offering that. And what type of, are you able to inform these different leaders within the fund that you're analyzing? Are you able to provide feedback to them and suggestions on what they can do to get a better score? I don't know if you can hear me. This is not really
hear you. I think Rick is frozen.
Oh, I hope it freezes on like a relatively, and not too terrible perspective. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Jeez. Well, I apologize for the technical difficulty.
Comment on what Rick was saying about
please do. Yeah.
Disclosures. I think that I'm working Southeast Asia, and similar to sort of infrastructure, the level of understanding and reporting is really variable geographically. So while there are some peers, and somebody in the box was talking about how it, ESG is in. So I think you go to other markets, and it's a very new term, and the ability to even baseline the most basic information is pretty rudimentary. So there's a long way to go in terms of making it a global practice.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Well, I'd love to hear from you, Courtney, and some of the work that you're doing from the standpoint of a financial institution. Can you add to what Rick was speaking to, and then add to a little bit about how you're helping to make this more standardized, or how you think we could make this more standardized?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to jump in, and thrilled to be part of the conversation today and learn from many of the fellow panelists who are working on this, as we've discussed, highly complex but important topic from so many directions. Very briefly, from the Morgan Stanley perspective, I think what brings us to the table in this conversation, much like our broad work in sustainable finance and sustainability across all of our businesses, it is a very specific focus on plastic waste. We committed in 2019 to a new initiative that we're calling the Plastic Waste Resolution, which is really a commitment in which we seek to facilitate the prevention, removal, and reduction of 50 million metric tons of plastic waste from entering the environment, including landscapes, landfills, and oceans, by 2030. So we know this is a long-term goal. We know this is a complex and multidimensional approach that we need to take. But even though we as a firm have a relatively small plastic footprint, if you will, of course, we have offices and employees working across the globe, and we're working internally across our employee base and operations to reduce any sort of single-use plastic that we may have. Really, the bigger opportunity for us and some of the other peers who've spoken on this panel is really thinking holistically around the entire flow of capital. We think about the end and really the value chain of plastic waste, right? This is going to be everything from how you measure and how you ultimately change the input materials to plastic. We've talked, there's some conversation around the transition to reusables, to compostables, to alternatives that we already have today, like paper, aluminum, and glass. There's not going to be a silver bullet, I think, to those input materials, and some of those are also going to require new business models. But all of that innovation and testing, both at the material level and the business operating model level, requires financing. And so that's really where a firm like Morgan Stanley and many others can play a significant role in providing that access to capital, connecting the innovators inside of corporations, whether they're newer, earlier stage companies that are built for purpose to solve this issue, or whether they're large existing blue chip companies that are retooling their supply chain or retooling the products and services that they provide to the market and are seeking to raise capital and align themselves or target ESG-minded investors on this topic. We think it's really important to speak a coherent message and to really think about this holistically. So again, we're excited to be at the table for this. We've happy to talk a little bit more about one of the indexes that Courtney Lawrence from Citi mentioned on the prior panel, but we really think this use of data is key. Ultimately, we're very supportive of organizations like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who we're a proud partner of, who are working to really bring this topic to the forefront and helping to bring industry participants together to speak a common language and think about common metrics, because as we've seen across the evolution of ESG and impact and sustainable investing, the proliferation of metrics and data can be a source of confusion. We think it can also be a really powerful tool for investors and for corporates to align their use of capital, but there's a lot of opportunity there to harmonize. And so we're looking at multiple sources of data to help investors target who we think and who to help them identify who the leading operators are when it comes to retooling our model to be more circular around the future of plastic. So I'll pause there, but happy to dive deeper on any of that.
No, Courtney, well, thank you so much. And, I in our earlier conversations and seeing all the work that your team is doing, I do appreciate Morgan Stanley taking a leadership role and really looking at this as an opportunity for investment and an opportunity for financial growth. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done up and down the supply chain. And I love that your team is looking at it as an opportunity of where to place that capital. It sounds like information about plastic data flows and stuff like that. What other pieces of information would be helpful for you to get better insights into where those opportunities for investment are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of work that's coming out of some of these broad industry coalitions that are thinking about the types of metrics that can be reported with regularity. I think plastic, as we've discussed, is a much more complex material flow. I think we've seen some great innovations, for example, in the carbon emissions space. We're a proud member of PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. I think remains to be seen if there will be a similar initiative specifically around plastic flows, but we think that there's a huge amount of opportunity there. Some leading academic researchers, for example, Dr. Jenna Jambach at the University of Georgia is also a great partner and leader in this space, and I think really looking at the flows of plastic that ultimately are the underlying issue that we seek to tackle. I think the investment investment community has really come together again around the carbon emissions and GHG emissions space, and has a common goal when we think about climate change from that perspective. But I think we really need to think holistically as an industry around how we measure and track and seek progress around plastic waste. So again, for our purposes in our plastic waste resolution, we're looking at preventing and removing plastic from the environment, which is ultimately the end goal that we're looking for. But we think there's a lot to be said around, different metrics that currently exist from company disclosures and other third-party data providers, whether that's, looking at the actual revenues of companies, the products and services that they're putting out, whether those are single-use plastics or coming from other reusable models. We think there's a lot of, company policies in place that can be analyzed, and company activities within their operations, whether they have take-back programs, whether they're looking at different sources of input materials. And so I think there's a lot of great data out there that can continue to be harnessed for smart decision making, but also a lot more data that can be standardized and brought to market to help enable the next wave of investment decision making in this space as well.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney. And I do think I'm with this this idea that this process of ESG, beginning to ask certain questions, pulling that data, it's beginning to help us wrap our head around how do we begin to collect information to quantify externalities. And that's how I see it, as an opportunity as well. So I'd love to actually hand this over. We have to wrap this up, but I'd love to hand this over to you, Jody, to close us out, because I just love how you see things in systems, and you came from a background of dealing with how to recycle solar panels. And so I just really admire how you think of material flows. So I just wanted to open the space for you for final thoughts of how we can think about solutions and where the solutions lie.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Raina, and I'm conscious of the time and John being here to move us to the next session. I guess as we look forward, it's great to see the group that's assembled here having real conversations about the challenges that we all face. I think many of us are part of platforms and partnerships that are working right now on some of these solutions. And I think the challenge for us all is, how do we look at this with a full systems view, both from a greenhouse gas emission perspective and from an environmental footprint perspective, because none of us want to see packaging waste or plastic waste in the environment. And we're all committed to achieving greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050. So the question is, how do we bring those two goals together with systems thinking and work together to create the new system of the future circular economy that's going to put us on a much more sustainable path? So I'll close there. I had received a chat message, I think, from Gabrielle asking Courtney to stay on the line. But
Okay,
maybe
Courtney and Rick.
In the line, please. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jody, and thank you, everybody, Anne and Courtney and Rick for joining us. Rick, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance too much to hear from you on this panel, but you'll be jumping on the next. Okay. Anyways, it was nice to meet you all. We'll talk soon.
Okay. Thanks very much, Raina. Sorry to spring that on you, Courtney and Rick, but because of the technical problems, we wanted to hear more from you. So if you could stay with us, really appreciate that. So the new joiner that we've got is Andrew Wetzel, CFA. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And if I may also say from a personal point of view, thank you for your help that you've been providing us in arranging this. Andrew is a principal managing director of sustainable investing and portfolio manager at FL Putnam Investment Management Company. All of you are on this panel are connected with the finance industry, and I want to go back to what our keynote speaker said. Greg turned around and said, investors play a pivotal role. The question I wanted to ask, if I can start with you, Andrew, and go to Courtney, then Rick, is that true?
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. I would say it's absolutely true. I think there's everyone plays a role here. This is, as we've learned today, and those who are experts in the field know, this is a tremendous problem. And there's no one solution. There's no one silver bullet, but certainly investors have a role to play. As anyone who's involved in this space and invested in this space knows, there is a tremendous long-term risk to the companies in the different parts of the supply chain. And the risk is not, even across these different companies. You have to really think about it at the industry level. And as an investor, how do you assess that risk? If these companies aren't going to be transparent with the details around toxic emissions, really strategy around becoming more sustainable over time, setting targets that actually matter, in the long term, there's no reasonable way to assess risk. So investors play a pivotal role in really pushing companies for more transparency. We heard it from Conrad, from As You Sow, doing this publicly, getting out and really showing the world that this information matters in a very public way. And then I think, as we heard from Greg, it's about broader investors engaging behind the scenes, as we all do on the fundamental active investment side, which is where we are. It's about having these conversations with management teams about investor relations, talking about what we need, what matters in terms of assessing risk. And it's really important for all of us to have these conversations and show companies that yes, this can be very public, but there's a really significant set of investors behind the scenes also pushing and showing the scale here.
Thank you. Courtney.
Yeah, I would echo really all of what Andrew just said. So thank you for that. I think with the caveat that investors can't act in a silo, I think we need to be well informed by leading NGOs and academic researchers and the corporates who are on the ground working on innovation. I think that investors have a huge role to play. The amount of philanthropic and public capital is not going to be enough to scale the innovations that we need to tackle and create a more circular economy for plastics. And so that private capital is going to be critical, and therefore investors are critical. And I think really in two ways that have been discussed. I think just to summarize what's been said, I think there's the stewardship angle. There's working with corporates to help them identify risks that investors might be seeing from taking that broad industry lens and thematic lens, and really helping them identify and move towards and encouraging that progress. And then also from actually allocating that new capital to innovations that are needed, right? There's going to be earlier stage and risky innovations that are going to need, venture and growth capital. And then at the later stages, there's, established technologies that need to scale, and there's infrastructure. And so this is really going to happen across all asset classes. And so again, I think that's really the power of conversations like this, is to shed light on this complex topic and to identify the opportunities that are needed to really scale that. But absolutely, that private capital and the role of investors is going to be critical to transforming this part of the economy.
Thank you. And then Rick, one of the things we keep hearing is this demand for data, the demand for transparency, and we need benchmarks. The financial market needs benchmarks. Can you meet this demand?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I definitely agree with the other panelists in the sense that the investment community is really critical to all of this, because they set the agenda for companies and they really drive that change over time. I think on the plastic issue, I think data has been a challenge for a long time, in the sense that only perhaps in the more recent years, we've had more significant voluntary disclosure around plastic use and plastic consumption and these kinds of metrics. Some of the data we've been collecting ourselves within the corporate sustainability assessment that S&P Global runs, but that's always building over time. And I think with more investor interest in that topic, it encourages companies to be more transparent, and we end up with more data that allows for better decision making. But I think ultimately, in order for investors to make an informed decision around where they want to direct their capital and what topics they want to engage with their investee companies on, they really need that information in order to do that. And similarly, on the question of benchmarks, they need to be able to demonstrate that they can achieve the kinds of financial returns they're looking for, whilst also delivering the environmental and social benefits that they really want to provide through their ESG strategy.
Thank you. Andrea, I actually want to give you the final word, because it seems to me you're the one under real pressure, because you got the fiduciary duties here. You're the portfolio manager. You've been listening to this webinar today. There's a lot to take in. What would be the nuggets that you're taking away as a portfolio manager?
I think sort of big picture, what Sharon said touched me, and I think we should all be thinking about how we can help her and her community. I think that's number one. There's a human impact here, and in the end, that's what really matters. So I think it's very easy to get lost in data and conversations with companies, but you got to take a step back on what really matters here. So my mind, my heart is with Sharon. It's a massive problem, big picture. There's no silver bullet. It's in all of the above approach. Everyone has to be involved. Consumers using less, governments setting thoughtful regulation, investors pushing companies for change. Importantly, industry groups getting together and trying to harmonize an approach to a more sustainable future. There's just no easy solution. So it really is all of the above. certainly phase out of problematic plastics, improved waste management and recycling. There was a great comment around scaling end markets, right? There has to be a demand for the recycled material, biodegradable materials. None of these in isolation can solve the problem. They all have to work together, and everyone has to play their role. As I think about this and some of the comments that were made around developed versus emerging, there's a tremendous risk to deglobalization. We know the developed world has to step up, has to help the emerging world. It's incredibly important, over the next decades. That's where the problem will be. So we have to think about that. And I would say investors just have to do their part. So we can't rely on high-level ESG scores in isolation. We have to dig deeper. We can't just avoid risk. We have to also seek out opportunities across markets and asset classes. It really is going to take everything and everyone to solve this challenge.
Thank you. Thank you. So no pressure there, Andrew. Thank you very much. And thank you to Courtney and Rick for staying on. I'm going to hand over to Gabriel because I think he's going to run an important message that's come in. Gabriel, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Andrew, Rick, and Courtney. Such an honor to have you participate today. And thank you, John. So for our closing keynote, we're honored to have Chairman Raul Grijalva, who provided us a video for the conference. If you don't know him, he's the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee for the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's the leading lawmaker in the U.S. House of Representatives working on plastics. So now I need to pivot to share the video, and when the video is done, I'll say thank you and we'll close the conference. 1 second, please.
Hello, I'm Representative Raul Grijalva, Chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, and I want to thank you for the kind invitation to join you today. I'm pleased to hear that the investment industry is interested in taking on the issue of plastics. We need people across every sector to work together to face this issue head on. The health and environmental costs of plastics are mounting, and we can't put off that reckoning any longer, and we've put it off much too long. When most people think about plastic pollution, they think about the plastic water bottles and straws floating in the ocean. But as we know, the problem starts during the production process. More than 99% of plastics come from fossil fuels, which are the leading cause of climate change. The process of removing raw materials for plastics, converting them into resins, and then using them in manufacturing generates dangerous levels of pollutants and greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. In addition, as we have seen time and time again, the plastic production process threatens communities of color, low-income communities, and other under-resourced communities. The most vulnerable of these communities are affected. These companies often site their plastic production facilities in these communities, polluting their air and water with harmful toxins. These environmental injustices are devastating the people who live in these communities. Some of you are already familiar with the stretch of Louisiana between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, lined with industrial plants and with plastic manufacturing centers that have been dubbed Cancer Alley. The area has one of the highest risks of cancer in the entire United States, and its residents are predominantly African American. That's just one example. All across the country, communities of color face compounded, often crippling threats caused by the reckless ongoing production of plastics in our country. The damage caused by plastic doesn't stop with the risks of the production process. The hundreds of millions of tons of plastic waste that we create each year permanently fill our landfills and oceans at a truly frightening rate. More than 40% of all plastics produced are only meant to be used one time. Here in the US, we are especially guilty of using and wasting far too much plastic. In fact, we generate more plastic waste per person than anywhere else on Earth. When all of this plastic waste enters the environment, it destroys our ecosystems and wildlife. We need swift, bold policy changes that reduce our dependency on both plastics and fossil fuels. We need investments in cleaner, more sustainable ways of living, and we need meaningful efforts to address the environmental injustices inflicted on communities that plastic production hurts the most. Fortunately, these efforts are picking up energy from grassroots level to Congress and on the international stage. In the House Natural Resources Committee, we have been working to spotlight the problem and advance real solutions. We led a community-driven process to create the most comprehensive environmental justice bill in congressional history, the Environmental Justice for All Act, which we reintroduced earlier this year. The Environmental Justice for All Act establishes environmental justice requirements, public advisory bodies, and federal programs to address the environmental inequities that disproportionately harm communities of color, low-income communities, and tribal and indigenous communities. Alongside this effort, I introduced the first ever bill in Congress for a tax on single-use plastic. But policymakers alone can't solve the problem. We need the help of people like you, leaders in finance and investment in that sector who can lead the way in building and incentivizing a cleaner economy. We already see a clear shift in the investment strategy of leading banks and asset managers when it comes to fossil fuels in our economy. Dozens of banks worldwide have committed not to fund oil drilling in the Arctic refuge, and BlackRock announced it would divest from thermal coal and screen its investments for climate risks, all going into the future. The investment community can play a critical role, and now more than ever we need similar leadership to help us reduce our plastic use and plastic pollution. Investments should shift to companies and industries that produce sustainable materials and products. By working together to reduce plastic consumption and waste, we can keep pollution out of our waterways, oceans, and food supplies. We can protect the health and well-being of all Americans, and we can take a much-needed step in attacking the climate crisis. Thank you again for this very kind invitation to speak with you about this very, very important issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for attending today. Today we had two profoundly important keynotes. A global leader in the capital markets, Gregory J. Fleming, who's had an extraordinary career, calling for all of us to coordinate and collaborate and take action together, work together for solutions. And we have the leading US lawmaker, Chairman Raul Grajilva, Chair of the Natural Resources Committee, US House of Representatives, asking us to do the same. Now it's up to you. You know how to contact us at Planet Tracker. Let's help us coordinate and work together and take action and move towards a sustainable world together. On that, I think of Sharon's passionate plea to listen and learn and work together. Thank you.